There's a kind of suffering that doesn't come from failure, abandonment, heartbreak, or even physical hardship. It's deeper than that. It's the kind of suffering that arises not from what happens to you, but from what awakens within you. When you begin to see the world differently, when your thoughts no longer match the surface-level conversations around you, when your questions become too big for easy answers, you suffer. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something is waking up inside of you that the world doesn't quite know how to hold. Carl Jung believed that the deeper the mind, the more intense the confrontation with the unconscious. And that confrontation is not gentle. It drags you far beneath the persona, the mask you wear in public, into the raw, uncomfortable truth of who you are and what reality is. For the average person, the mask is enough. They live through roles: the good student, the loyal employee, the responsible parent. But for those with awakened minds, the mask begins to itch, to suffocate. It becomes unbearable to pretend. So they start asking dangerous questions. Who am I beneath this identity I perform? Why do I feel like I'm observing life rather than living it? Why does everyone else seem content with things that feel empty to me? These are not signs of dysfunction. These are signs of depth. But depth comes at a price, because the deeper you go into yourself, the more you see what others ignore. You recognize the falseness in social norms, the shallowness of small talk, the quiet desperation in the eyes of people who are successful but spiritually starved. And this perception isolates you. You can't unsee it. You can't unknow it. So you suffer, not from external punishment, but from internal expansion. Your consciousness has grown too large for the container society built for it. And Jung would say, this is the beginning of individuation, the psychological process of becoming whole. But wholeness isn't about being happy all the time. It's about integrating everything: the light, the shadow, the sacred, the shame. And this is why the deepest minds suffer the most, because they are tasked with seeing everything. And seeing everything includes seeing the abyss. When your mind begins to operate on this level, you don't just live in the world, you begin to see through it. You see through your own ego, your own defense mechanisms, your inherited beliefs. You see through the persona of others, the unconscious games, the emotional masks. You begin to notice the gap between what people say and what they mean, between what they do and what they truly want. And that clarity is both a gift and a burden. Because with it comes the realization that most people are not ready to meet themselves, let alone meet you in your fullness. And so you feel like an alien in a world obsessed with distraction. You long for conversations that touch the soul, but are surrounded by noise. You crave meaning, but are constantly offered entertainment. You want to heal, but healing requires solitude, shadow work, and silence. 3 things the modern world avoids at all costs. This disconnect between your inner reality and the collective illusion is the root of your suffering. But as Jung taught, suffering is not the enemy. It's the signal. It means the soul is pressing against the limits of your current life and asking to be born. And like any birth, it comes with pain. So if you're suffering not because of a single event, but because of a depth you can't explain, know this: you are not broken. You are being initiated. And the pain you feel is not weakness. It's the sound of the old self breaking so something truer can rise. You're not alone. You're just ahead of your time.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
The shadow and the light, how suffering becomes the bridge to your truest self the moment we begin to suffer not from external circumstances, but from the unbearable weight of our own awareness. We cross a threshold that most people never even approach. This suffering, as Jung would say, is not pathological, it is transformational. It is the psyche's way of demanding evolution. And the first step in this evolution is the confrontation with the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is not something to be destroyed or denied. It is simply the part of ourselves that we have not yet owned. It is everything we repress, deny, or are ashamed to admit about ourselves. But it's also where our vitality lives, our power, our authenticity. The shadow is the dark soil where the roots of the self grow. And until we are willing to go into that darkness, We remain half alive, fractured, constantly performing a version of ourselves that wins approval but starves the soul. This is why the deepest minds suffer. They are called to integrate the shadow while others are still busy pretending it doesn't exist. Integration is not a pretty process. It's not found in motivational quotes or feel-good affirmations. It's found in the moments when you're alone and trembling, when everything you thought you would begins to fall apart. You begin to see that your strength was often just survival, that your kindness masked fear of rejection, that your ambition was fueled by a desperate need to prove your worth. These are humbling realizations. They shatter illusions of identity, but they also make space for something more honest. The problem is, we've been taught to fear this honesty. We've been taught that to admit our flaws is to collapse. But Jung saw it differently. He believed that the way to light is through the shadow, that the only path to wholeness is through the parts of ourselves we most avoid. And so the suffering deep minds endure is not a punishment, it's a passage, a sacred rite of psychological rebirth. But this passage is lonely. When you begin to integrate your shadow, you stop playing the roles that made others comfortable. You stop laughing at jokes that aren't funny. You stop agreeing with ideas that don't resonate with your soul. You stop rescuing people who refuse to grow. And this creates distance. People accuse you of changing, of becoming cold, withdrawn, arrogant. But what they really mean is, you're no longer who I need you to be to avoid facing myself. And this is where another level of suffering emerges, not just from your own inner work, but from the space it creates between you and others. The deeper you go into yourself, the fewer people can meet you there. Not because they're bad, but because they're not ready. And you have to grieve that. You have to mourn the loss of old dynamics, of relationships that once felt safe, but now feel shallow. This grief is sacred. It purifies. It empties. It makes room for more aligned connections. But first, it breaks you. And yet, in the breaking, something extraordinary happens. You begin to feel whole, not because you fixed everything, but because you're no longer running from anything. You stop trying to be the light all the time, and you start realizing that your darkness has wisdom, that your sorrow holds truth, that your anger is a boundary, that your fear is asking for care, not suppression. You begin to integrate. This doesn't mean you become perfect. It means you become real. And being real is the most radical act in a world built on performance. Jung believed that true wholeness has a polarity. It includes the sinner and the saint, the hero and the coward, the child and the elder. To be whole is to stop dividing yourself into acceptable and unacceptable. It is to realize that everything you've been taught to fear within yourself is actually a key to your liberation. And it is this realization that transforms suffering from a burden into a bridge. So ask yourself, which parts of me have I disowned in order to be loved? What emotions have I labeled as bad that might actually be trying to protect me? Where in my life am I still performing instead of being? These questions aren't comfortable, but they are powerful. Because when you begin to answer them honestly, you begin to reclaim yourself, piece by piece. Layer by layer, you start to realize that the suffering you've experienced was never random. It was a call to return to your center. And the deeper your mind, the louder that call becomes. This is why the deepest minds suffer the most, not because they are broken, but because they are being broken open, cracked by truth, rebuilt by insight, and forged into something capable of holding all of life, not just the light, but the shadow too. That is the work. That is the path, and it is worth every tear. The alchemy of pain, turning inner chaos into wisdom, power, and peace, the final transformation for the suffering. Awakened mind is not just to survive the darkness, but to alchemize it. As Carl Jung understood, the human psyche has the potential not only to endure suffering, but to transmute it into profound wisdom, power, and peace. This is not poetic optimism, it is psychological truth. When we stop resisting pain and begin to understand its language, it becomes a guide, not an enemy. pain, especially the deep kind that thinkers and feelers carry, is full of symbols. It points toward what is missing, what is unresolved, what still waits in the unconscious to be claimed. The chaos within us is not senseless, it is meaningful, but only if we are willing to sit with it, dissect it, and ultimately integrate it. Jung called this the transcendent function, the process through which opposites in the psyche, light/dark, ego/shadow, masculine/feminine, are brought into dialogue, creating something greater than either side alone. In other words, your suffering can become the fuel for your evolution. But this alchemy doesn't happen automatically. It requires discipline, introspection, and brutal honesty. The deeper mind must learn how to structure itself. Because without structure, depth collapses into despair. Without integration, insight becomes overwhelm. And this is where many deep minds get stuck. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack tools. They drown in the ocean of their own perception. That's why philosophy, psychology, and spiritual practice exist. Not to entertain us, but to hold us steady while we process the immensity of our own existence. You need frameworks to hold your depth. You need rituals to ground your thoughts. You need to talk to people who understand what it means to question everything and still choose to live. Deep minds must build strong vessels, because the more consciousness you carry, the more weight you must bear. Wisdom is heavy, but that weight is sacred. It is the weight of knowing, and knowing, when carried with grace, becomes power. Power, in this case, is not dominance over others. It's sovereignty over the self. It's the ability to sit in chaos without losing your center, to feel everything but be consumed by nothing. This is what Jung meant when he talked about individuation, the emergence of a self that is no longer enslaved by the unconscious. When you reach this point, your suffering no longer defines you, it refines you. It starts to see clearly. The trauma wasn't your fault, but the healing is your responsibility. The world may not reward your depth, but your soul does. You look back on your darkest nights and realize they were classrooms. You remember the days you felt like giving up and realize they were initiations. You start to notice how your pain gave you empathy, how your breakdown gave you boundaries, how your loneliness taught you to listen to yourself, to silence, to the subtle voice of the soul. And that voice, once barely a whisper, becomes your compass. But even then, the world won't always understand you, and that's okay. Part of the journey is learning to live without constant validation, to stop needing others to see your truth before you believe it yourself. The deepest minds are not here to fit in, they are here to expand what it means to be human. Not everyone will follow you into the depths, and they're not supposed to. Some people are meant to live on the surface. Others, like you, are born to dive. And the further you go, the more you realize that your suffering wasn't a detour. It was the way. It shaped your integrity. It sharpened your intuition. It opened your heart. And now you're not just someone who thinks deeply. You're someone who lives wisely. That kind of presence changes everything. You become a mirror, a lighthouse, a quiet revolution. You don't have to speak loudly. Your depth speaks for you. So ask yourself now, what have I learned from my suffering? What strength did I gain that I couldn't have earned any other way? How can I use my pain, not to build walls, but to build bridges? These are the final questions, the ones that take all the chaos and turn it into clarity. And when you answer them honestly, you begin to see the full arc of your journey, not just as a series of struggles, but as a sacred unfolding. Jung said, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order." Your suffering was never meaningless. It was your path back to yourself. And now that you've walked it, scarred but sovereign, you carry something rare, depth that has been earned, not inherited. Pain that has been transformed, not avoided. Wisdom that cannot be taught, only lived. That is why the deepest minds suffer the most. Not because they are condemned, but because they are called. Called to feel deeper, to think clearer, and to rise stronger, so that they can become exactly what the world needs, even if the world doesn't know it yet.